My interest in Zimmel came from generally a kind of dissatisfaction with the current state of substantivism as a kind of another intellectual movement. I think Zimmel is included within substantivism, but Zimmel's substantivism has been quite underplayed. It has a great potential to revitalize or resubstantiate a substantivism that as I said, I'm quite particularly dissatisfied with. And the reason for that is because I think Zimmel's substantivism is located in this wider pantheon of vitalist philosophy, and it centers particularly on this kind of, as a lot of vitalist philosophy does, on this kind of concept of élan vital, this kind of vital force and life, and from life to a monadic concept of society and the individual in society, which is incredibly important for understanding or for developing a more coherent and more beneficial theoretical approach to understanding things like the economy.
I should probably say something about what Mark might mean by substantivism. I mean, the kind of way, well, I think both of us got into it, was the critique of, you know, which is really a weird way to get into it, because as we know, Zimmel has a strong notion of form. Let's leave that out, leave that to the side for the moment. Zimmel's notion of form. That the Methodenstreit between neoclassical economics, Menger, that Weber was in, and against Schmoller, has been understood in terms of formalism versus substantivism. And the formalists were the neoclassicists that went right back to Smith's classical political economy. And a lot of people have understood Schmoller and the historical school, and in Zimmel's like third generation historical school, as substantivists, which I think also map. So I think that's important. But then within that, I think Mark is sort of saying that even that's not enough. You want to make, either you want to make a substantivism into a vitalism, or you think that vitalism breaks with substantivism? Well,
I mean, if you kind of rewind a bit and go back, you mentioned my PhD, and my PhD was essentially, you know, it's about China. It's about the, you know, China's
supervisor.
Yeah, it's about China's rising economy, and this is another kind of economy, and as another kind, an other kind of economy that represents a very real challenge, not only for international relations, but for social theory and sociological theory. And I think that that has been grappled with by this group of people called the substantivists. All of the classics talked about form and substance in one way or another. Marx's value form and value substance, and Durkheim is the sacred and the profane, and so on and so on. But the older, if you like, if it's the old economic sociology, was more about the disembedding of relations into form. It's concentrated on the form and objective life, I think. Whereas the new economic sociology and the substantivism around that is much more a kind of politics of trying to re-embed the economy in social relations.
I think they make, I disagree. I think economic sociology isn't that old in a lot of ways. It depends where you want to start it. But I would have thought that, you know, SASE, the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, and all those started 20 years ago. And it was Granovetter and all that stuff. And then there's a certain amount of actor network got into it. For me, it's pretty formalist and not substantivist. I don't think it embeds properly. I think it depends how you read Polanyi. I mean, but
Polanyi is about embeddedness, and I think Mark Granovetter is essentially just run from Polanyi.
No, I think Mark Granovetter has a much, He's got formal networks. It's weak ties. Granovetter is, I mean, Polanyi is strong ties. You know, it's proper, you know, kind of embeddedness. Veblen, you know, who interviewed Schmoller, who reviewed some of the Schmoller stuff. No, I think it's. I do think that I agree with you in the sense that I would see Marxian use value. I didn't used to, but now I think use value is a bit like value substance, and exchange value is value form. So it's formalism also versus. I agree with substantivism in the dialectic, but substantivism comes from well, the historical school. We're strongly Hegelian, whereas the formalists are neo-Kantian right down the line. Neo-Kantian in a positivist sense, and but I think the problem is then where I thought you were going, is that even the notion of substance is a problem.
Yeah.
You know that substance is. It's surely not formal homo. It's the opposite of formal homo economicus. But substance itself could be, you know, straight Aristotelian substance. It could be itself, you know, all sorts of. It could be, you know, it could be very problematic. Anyway, as we know, when you read Polanyi, it's not that great. On the other hand, Brodel is, and so is Zombart. These people that, and Zombart and Brodel very close, and Pirenne, who is, and Zombart very close, writing at the same time, who have this kind of story of the history of capitalism. You know, that's about circulation. It starts in Venice, you know, with long distance shipping, and where there's a huge concentration and circulation of capital. Very different to Max Weber's story of Benjamin Franklin and the little guy, you know, doing that stuff. And then, but I think that's formal, whereas for, again, maybe I'm getting it wrong, whereas for, I guess it's a more difficult topic than we're all thinking, even I'm thinking, because now when I'm reading, because for Zombart, the kind of stuff that was going on in the guilds and the medieval city was substance, and formal was capital accumulation outside of there. So that makes it more complex, doesn't it, really? And yeah, so I'm kind of agreeing that you're right. But I think Laban's philosophy, even, you know, in the way you're using it, and when anybody uses it, actually deconstructs substance too, doesn't it, really? Yeah. And not just form. It's something different, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's doing both things. I mean, maybe we should go back and maybe what I should say is really for the last 3 or 4 years of my kind of academic life, as it were, I've been very much engaged in this realm of economic sociology in a way that I don't think Scott has. And whether we want to call that essentially substantivism or not, let's leave that aside for a minute. But the problem, and I think this is completely correct, is that it is still based, even though it doesn't admit it, in a neoclassical kind of way of thinking about the economy.
Or even a neoclassical reading of Marxism.
Sure. And I think that the only way to essentially get around that, which they haven't considered, because, you know, if you read these books by these people who write in economic sociology, they do go into, in some of them at least, quite a lot of depth to try and go back to basics and think about what is value and where does value come from, and then how do you get from theories of value to a theory of economy. But they never go away from the Weberian thing. So I think that where Zimmel, well, this is the point. I mean, where Zimmel becomes incredibly relevant, even as a classical sociologist, is in the originality of his, what I would call, and I think you've called it as well, his sociological vitalism. And from that point of departure, from this kind of philosophy of life, you can get to a very different sociology of the economy, like, for example, what you see in the Money book. It's not because I don't feel comfortable with the concept itself. I think it's a great concept. It's just that I wouldn't summarize my approach as being a relational one. Like, I wouldn't reduce myself to Zimmel's work per se, because I think that Zimmel is part of a much wider body of literature, a substantivism, potentially.
Well, you want a more strongly vitalist position than relational position.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it probably is. I think that Zimmel's position is relational.
I think that the strength of Zimmel's position lies in monadism, the monadic kind of side of how he views life. And for me, that is very important. But I don't see that as necessarily exclusive to Zimmel. And I think that you can see a lot of the kind of stuff that Zimmel talks about in other authors, particularly for me, Deleuze and Guattari, desiring machines, these kind of concepts. So I wouldn't like to just focus on Zimmel in that sense and say that my approach is a relational one. I think that Zimmel's approach, his relational approach, fits within what I consider to be a very powerful critique of neoliberalism. It's more like an intellectual movement. Like it ranges across multiple authors.
You are more of a Laban's philosophy critique, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that his relational critique is really interesting. And I can say it, and I didn't really understand it till yesterday or the day before, which I can articulate in 1 minute, I guess, which is that, okay, which is well, and Mark, I think Mark has yet a different position than these. It's not that labor, it's not a labor power notion. It's not a utilitarian notion or neoclassical, that's a marginal utility at all. And then he says that value comes from this series of valuations, this series of valuations often, this series of transactions, sometimes he says, this series now of what you guys in the conference understood as Wechselwirkungen, which is, I don't know how to translate that, but it's a affective quasi-reciprocity. You know what it is, you know, and it's, which I think is right. And this series itself, in the relation of all of that, constitutes value. And money here is a transcendental outside of the series, like a Kantian regulative idea, you know, which the three regulative ideas, which are not in the understanding, but in the sphere of reason, which some people see as substance rather than form, right? Which is you know, God, freedom, and immortality, but it's money, you know, and I think that's what's going on. I mean, but I take your point in terms of your Laban's. You're wanting to have a Laban's.
Yeah, but I don't. I think
it's a great idea what you're doing. Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you said at all. In fact, I think I think I probably agree with you, but we just talk about it in different ways. Your series is for me something that I would locate in Zimmel's concept of the ought, which is something that I was planning to talk about tomorrow, which I see his concept of the ought, I think, is incredibly important for his life sociology, and I think that is the level on which that series kind of operates, in which individuals kind of become mediated by form, and I think that through that process you can see in that process even a cultural theory of value. So we're talking about the same thing but in different ways.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I think that the series of valuations is set up as opposite to this series of cognitions. And the series of cognitions is neoclassical economics. You know, in cognition, and then it becomes, you know, then it becomes homo economicus. The series of valuations, he often talks about in terms of practice and not theory. So it's not, you know, it's not cognition, it's something else. But I can see why you want to put it in the ought. But I think I'd rather put it in something like something that's more aesthetic than the ought. You know, it truly doesn't come from the second critique. But on the other hand, you probably don't want a second critique notion of the ought either. No. You know, so in your way, I could see how it's a bit of an ought.
Yeah.
Because you're not putting categorical imperative in there at all. You're putting something else. It kind of collapses the two, you know. Yeah. It collapses the two, doesn't it?
Well, that's what we're getting at. I think that the value of Zimmel's cultural theory of value, as I would like to put it, consists in the way in which it's able to dissolve that kind of Kantian dualism and build something quite radically new, I think. That it's been quite overlooked historically. Or if it hasn't been overlooked, then not understated. I would probably, understated is a better way of putting it. Because, as we know, a lot of people are actually highly influenced by Zimmel.
It's been overlooked.
But just don't give him credit where it's due.
You were at that conference. I was in Kyoto this year. The substantive stuff that we're talking about didn't get a look in. It was straight formalism right down the line. Some of it was Marxist, some of it was actor network formalism.
Because if you talk about relational approaches in sociology, and Zimmel as being a relational theorist of some kind, you've written that China is a relational culture, or you've written about this idea.
Right? Without a Zimmelian sense at all.
Yeah.
So I agree with you a
right.
little bit. Yeah.
So I think I think this is part of that. There's a great deal of theoretical fit between a relational approach to understanding and theorizing the economy and what we've kind of posited, I suppose, as a relational culture through the experience of studying it and seeing how it works, and through understanding things like the Chinese lineage in small villages in China.
And even Confucian assumptions that are there all the time.
Yeah.
You know, which is somewhere between the sacred and the profane.
Yeah.
You know, but it has to do with gift, like.
Yeah.
Because the social bond in Confucianism is li, L-I, but not the reason li, but the ritual li. But it's like protocol and everyday kind of respect.
And there's a huge body of literature that's come out on the subject of what is known in...
Our guy.
Yeah.
Michael Dutton, who is the co-supervisor, who's the missing person here, is cleverer than both of us. Well, maybe not cleverer, Mark.
No, there's a huge body of literature on the subject of what the Chinese call guanxi, which roughly translates as social networks, which has been not necessarily approached from a kind of Zimmelian perspective, but it ends up looking like a kind of relational sociology of a relational culture in the end, looking at the dyad and the kind of the relational structure of Chinese interaction and how deeply embedded Chinese interaction is in, for example, Confucianism.
What would Zimmel would have said, though, about it? Because he would want a stronger subject-object split, which he would then recombine in his ways. Because in China, it's not that fully split. You know, when representation is iconic, you know, through resemblance, rather than the kind of propositional stuff that we get in the West. Then subject and object are not fully split, but they are partly split. There is representation going on there.
Yeah.
And it would be fascinating if Zimmel were still alive to... Benjamin saw it as mimesis. Walter Benjamin, the mimetic faculty, which he used to talk about. But he didn't know anything about China. But we got to get Zimmel back and teach him Chinese and send him over to Beijing, you know.
Yeah.
Georg Zimmel in Beijing.
Like Adam Smith in Beijing.
Exactly.